Gnomish. You know, I purposely try to film when people aren't doing stupid things. And yet, hello and welcome back to Tabletop Archives, where I talk about how to homebrew your own D&D world and other D&D related things. Language. It's not just a class we all hated in high school. It's also an important part of character creation. When a player is creating their character, there's a lot of different things that they have to consider. Stats, background, skill proficiencies, all of the like. But what's included in that is also languages. Now, most of the time, if you were to ask a player to pick a language of their own choosing, I don't know, they'll like pick Celestial, I guess, because that's angels. In all honesty, most players aren't gonna really care too much what languages they know outside of the ones that they're automatically given. Now sure, this is different if you're playing like Descend into Avernus, if you're doing a homebrew campaign that specifically fights devils, takes place in the Abyss, takes place in the Underdark. Your players might actually pick those languages because, you know, they're going to be important. But what happens if you're just telling them to just make a character? What languages do they pick then? I'm here to hopefully help answer the question of how do we break down how languages work in D&D 5e? I'm only going to be looking at specifically the languages found in the player's handbook. As you know, Ravnica has had its own thing. Various new supplements keep coming out and they'll keep having their own races and whatnot. But I'm going to look at only the ones in the player's handbook. And then also we're going to talk about how to make your own custom languages for your own world. So the first thing to know about language is the fact that we have language nowadays, which means how we look at language in our own worlds should mirror that. It doesn't have to, of course, you know, do what you want. But it really makes it seem more fleshed out if you do. So quick history lesson. I gotta use that college degree somehow. Most languages that are common right now come from previous languages that come from previous languages that come from previous languages that come from previously, all the way back to one specific language that we don't know about because history is difficult. For example, English, Spanish, a little bit of French as well, is derived from Latin. Latin is a dead language. And it's not that like someone murdered it, though that would be a cool idea. It's more that no one verbally speaks Latin except history majors who are forced to take a Latin class, and the teacher thinks it'd be a swell idea to have everyone speak Latin even though it's a dead language and all people really use Latin for is to read ancient ruins. Yeah, I'm not bitter about that. You are. Shut up. So Latin eventually became 3 separate languages, and in D&D, if you look at the page, that number will appear right here. It's in the player's handbook. I should have looked it up before filming this. If you look up on that page, you're going to find that there is a breakdown of how the languages work and also where they're derived from. So that's what we can do, is we can basically figure out what would be modern day equivalencies to our fantasy worlds and just work at it that way. For example, if we were to find a 5th edition equivalent to Latin, I think the best choice would be primordial. If you look at the page, you'll see that there's a section where it talks about what script is used for each language. We can use that as a point to figure out how things are derived from each other. Now you're going to notice that primordial, it says it's Dwarvish, so shouldn't that mean Dwarvish is Latin because everything else is Dwarvish as well? No! Primordial is pre-mortal. It's the earliest language. If anything, it should be Latin more than anything else. And that's how we should treat it in our campaigns as well. It shouldn't be a verbal language that is spoken per se, but perhaps a written language that people know how to translate rather than to speak. Now, of course, you can have some weird things. Yes, there's like the different types of primordial that have to do with each of the elemental planes, but we can also say that those in and of itself haven't had as much growth. Those civilizations and societies haven't grown as much as the material plane, thus the reason they're still performing that old language. And it'd actually be interesting if you had a character who spoke primordial, went to the airplane, and someone is speaking and he's like, oh, that's what it sounds. Oh crap, I have to figure out how to pronounce all of these words. It could make for an interesting encounter. So, primordial is our Latin. Well, what does it derive into? What are the things that come out of primordial? It's basically anything else that has the Dwarven script, basically. So obviously Dwarvish is derived from Primordial. We also have Giant, Gnomish for some reason, Goblin, and Orc. All of these use the same script of Dwarvish, and again, if we're assuming that Primordial should be the Latin-esque main language these all come from, then what we do is have those other languages come from there. Now, we can also make it very interesting. If someone knows Dwarvish but not Giant, maybe there's some correlation. Maybe they're able to get every other word because it is derived from the same language. It can actually make for very interesting things. A goblin who only knows Goblin is somehow the only person who's able to somewhat talk to an orc. That'd be very fascinating. Of course, this is all up to you. Do what you want. But I think we can have that breakdown, and it would work pretty well. In fact, it works so well, let's do it again. The next Latin-esque language that will have other languages derived from it is going to be Sylvan. Again, if you look at the chart, Elvish is another common one that pops up. And if we're taking the same approach that Elven is not as old as Dwarvish, Sylvan makes sense. Sylvan is the language of the Feywild, and it even makes even more sense that Elvish would be derived from that because elves canonically come from the Feywild. The reason Undercommon is there is because of Drow. That's right, you can put the Dark Elves in Undercommon, and that's how all these other races start to find out, just the sharing of these languages. They all start to understand a version of Sylvan Undercommon. So we got our two starting languages, and we got what they derive into. Still leaves like a handful of languages left. Going to be a little bit more difficult. We obviously see that Common and Halfling go next to each other. So we know that Halfling and Common belong together. They're both the common script. But there's no other language, none in the normal or the exotic languages that fit that. But what if Celestial did? I'm saying we should, in this moment, switch the script. Sorry. So to speak, on Celestial. Make that derive into Common and Halfling. Why does Celestial, the language of the gods, go into Common and Halfling? Maybe human are more devoted. Maybe humans have a divine birthright. Maybe there's something else in your world that can bring to that. But out of the remaining exotic languages, it makes the most sense for Celestial to be driven into Common and Halfling. But that still leaves us with a handful of other ones, right? What do we do with those? Simple. They're languages mortals don't understand. We're going to call them unknown languages, unknowable languages, just languages that you have to really go out of your way to find out how they make sense. So obviously Tieflings, if they have like that bond with a fiend throughout their bloodline, maybe it makes sense that genetically they just know that language of Infernal or Abyssal. But if someone else, a scholar, wants to be able to read this book on Infernal, they're going to have to do some research, possibly go into the Nine Hells or the Abyss themselves. We're also going to throw in here Deep Speech, Draconic, Thieves' Cant, and Druidic. The reason I put Thieves' Cant and Druidic in there is because technically they're languages, they're just locked to a specific class. But they fit in this idea that in order for people to understand it, they had to have gone out of their way to learn this language. This isn't someone taking a Latin class and finding out how to speak Primordial because they were gnomes and they figured it out. No, this is people who have to do something, whether it's a society like Thieves' Cant that have developed this language and rapport with each other, or it's Druidic, which in and of itself can't be taught to a non-Druid, or else the person who taught it loses the ability to speak that language. You can have various different reasons for why these specific ones are just unknown to your players. And maybe your players do know it, and then you ask, how do they know it? What did they do to find out? If they're a druid or a rogue, they just naturally know it based off of their backstory, but I would still encourage you to ask them who taught them that, how did they find out? So we have the main languages that then derive into smaller, more common languages, and then we have the unknowns that people have to actively seek out and actively study and possibly even live in the world of in order to find out how to speak them. And as you can see, there's already lore reasons for why these languages work the way they do. Celestial feeds into human. Is there something there? Sylvan leads into Elvish. Clearly there's lore reasons there. Why is Abyssal, Deep Speech, and Infernal hard for people to know, but Tieflings might know them naturally? There could be multiple reasons for why you do that, and that's the fun of world building. But now let's move on to how we can do this for custom languages that we ourselves come up with. So I have about 3 different ways we can break down these languages, and honestly, they are, again, copies of how we do it in our own world. So the first one is having regional dialects. So versions of another language, let's say common, but people have different dialects to the point where sometimes they'll say things that you're like, what? For example, in the southern states of America, people have nomenclature that's vastly different than the Midwest, the North. Britain has different dialects than America because, again, they're different cultures. You know, there's still going to be those awkward interactions, but that makes for fun role play. So start with a dialect. For example, in my world, I basically have a dialect for each of the different continents. Shirian, Fioran, Dalaran, these are all dialects. You don't need to know them to get somewhere, but sometimes someone's going to say something in common and you're like, I don't understand that. It's like, yeah, because you're from a different place. And that makes sense. You can also do what, again, is done in this real world and have forgotten languages. So the history buffs out there are going to know that the language that we have a complete understanding of, that is the oldest language, is that of Linear B. The fact that we know Linear B, which means we know there was a Linear A. We know that there was a language before Linear B, but we just don't have the full understanding of how to really understand that language. And that could be the same for D&D. Primordial could be Linear B. It could be the last language we know. And then we have a Linear A. Something even before that. Something taking place previously. So for example, in my world, I have different ages breaks down. You can check that. I pointed to both corners because I'm not sure which corner it is that the eye is in. Where I break down my different ages of my custom world. So for example, the current age is the Age of Restoration. Before then was another age, but it's basically very similar. It's like mixing together the same age. But basically the BC or the BCE, whatever you want to call it, of my world was the Serene Age. So that was where people were mainly using Primordial. Maybe Common or Dwarvish or Elvish were starting to slowly develop, but that's really where Primordial came from. Rewind to the previous age, the Age of Ascension. The world doesn't have much history on that. Whether that's because history wasn't taken, it was destroyed. There's various different reasons for that. But in that time, those people would have understood a different language known as Primal. I recommend coming up with some forgotten languages, like Primal in mind, where it's just the Linear A, where we know it exists, we know it's a language, we have no idea what it means. And that even makes certain spells like Comprehend Languages even more important, because that's the only way you're going to understand what's going on. And then finally, we go back to unknown languages. Again, these are your Infernals, your Deep Speech, your Draconic, your Thieves' Cants. Come up with your own unique language, unique code system that people understand. You can make up whatever you want, but I made up a different language, an unknown language known as Arcadian, the language of magic. You can come up with mechanic, machinist, whatever you want to call it, where like golems and like built robots or whatever you have in your world have this language with each other. Maybe Warforged know it, Warforged. But having unknown languages where the players are like, wait, that's a cool language. Can I learn that? It's like, yes, you can, but you have to take time to learn it. It's not going to just be like, the elf can teach you it. Like, you have to actively go out of your way for it. And in my world, Arcanian, it's only known by a select few magic users. And they don't want other people to know it. And Modify Memory is a very, very good spell to make sure that doesn't happen. So there you go. That's how we can use our real-world language and structure and how that works out to make our personal fantasy worlds a little bit more unique and interesting and realistic. If you have any ideas for cool custom languages, put them in the comments, say what they mean, or don't. Be that guy. I actually enjoy people being that guy. It's really cool. But please, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, share it to your friends, tell others about this channel. I'm really thankful for anyone who finds these videos and decides to watch them. So thank you so much for doing that, and I'll see you next time.